personal log entry 73-4. Now then, where did I leave off? Ah, yes. As I have previously mentioned, the Dalek pathweb collates all useful information from various invasions, conquests, and, although the Emperor does not wish for it to be spoken of, defeats. Regardless, all information is gathered, be it from battle statistics or taken from the enemy databases, and I must confess I have developed a particular fascination with looking myself up in the pathweb archives. Of course, all of the information is not necessarily correct. The many different circumstances of my deaths are often widely exaggerated, and despite my Daleks being widely viewed as the most evil race in the galaxy, the hypocrisy of other species spreading misinformation like propaganda to their people cannot help but evoke the distant memories I have of my early days on Skaro. As one of the scientific elite, I was privy to the more reliable sources of information to which the general public were not. Indeed, it was often our duty to spin the devastation our neutronic bombs caused into more positive lights, collateral necessities, if you will, ones that would turn the tide of the war. If a village of non-combatants died, we would make sure it was revealed that they were, regrettably, located in the same area as a factory involved with the production of devastating weapons. If a hospital was destroyed, and many innocent casualties along with it, it was made known that agents of our own, inside the Thal's own scientific elite, had confirmed and passed to us information that they were conducting gross experiments on their own people, and that the destruction our bombs caused not only put a stop to their experiments, but were also a mercy killing to those they were testing on. However, the reality of the situation was far more grim and hypocritical than anyone outside of the elite units knew. The aim of the neutronic wars was never to subjugate the Thals, but to destroy them utterly. For our own people, the Khalids, to take their rightful place as the supreme and singular rulers of Skaro. This was, of course, another fact hidden from the general populace. We knew a day would come when the utter extermination of the Thals would have to be addressed, that we would have to tell our people that through an unfortunate combination of conflict, carelessness, and self-destruction on their part, we were able to defeat the Thals, but that whilst we suspected that some of them may have survived, their leaders and the majority of their populace had indeed been destroyed. A sad and regrettable end to the centuries-old conflict. We knew, of course, that not everyone would believe this, that there would be dissent. For almost as long as the conflict had raged, there had been murmurs that perhaps what the colored elites were telling the people was not entirely truthful. Of course, with the elite already having sown the seeds of information being passed to us by our own agents inside the Thal elite, it was not difficult to contrive and cultivate the idea that certain dissenters in our own ranks were in fact Thal spies. Dissent of this nature could not be seen to be tolerated, of course, and so spies must be made an example of. And I suppose that is where it all began, where I, previously a mere humble researcher of the scientific elite, made his entrance into the fray. I reasoned that while spies must be made an example of in public, perhaps there was another way that they could also be used to make examples of them in private. Examples of how our race might endure and survive. You see, another vital piece of information that had been withheld from the populace was the condition of Skaro outside the dome. Our people had no need to venture outside the city vaults miles underground. Our recirculation filtration systems provided us with fresh air and clean water. Refuse and natural waste was broken down and processed by our reactors into renewable energy. The ministers of the survival elite even managed to convince the populace that their dead could be reprocessed in order to provide our botanical systems with ample sustenance for growing more crops. A stroke of genius on their part. But whilst our people continued their lives in relative safety, they did not know that most of them would never see the surface world again. The neutronic bombs of both sides had devastated the landscape, petrified the once green forest, towns and cities lay in ruins. To all intents and purposes, Skaro had become a dead planet. But as the survival elite pointed out in regular council meetings, our race could not survive beneath the surface indefinitely. Skaudo's surface would not be habitable for thousands of generations to come, and if they remained underground, our city would eventually become contaminated, our resources would deplete, and our people would be dead in less than 100 generations. It was therefore put forward by the scientific elite, by myself, in fact, to design and create a series of travel machines that would allow our people to venture outside the city and the dome. They were never intended to be a means of survival in themselves, but if extensions could be made to the exterior of the dome from the outside, which could then be sealed off and decontaminated from the inside, it was perfectly feasible to extend and rebuild the city, allowing for more space for our people, but also space to extend our processing plants and, by extension, our resources. We would, of course, require test subjects to ensure these travel machines worked. The attitudes of the elite rose themselves far above being used for tests themselves, and as our ultimate goal was to ensure the survival of our race, naturally, using our own people to trial these machines was not a viable option. Which brings us back around to the spies. Here we had people who, to all intents and purposes of the general public, had been executed as traitors, but in reality had been kept in the laboratory vaults. Needless to say, their executions had to have been seen, otherwise suspicions would have been raised, but with some careful planning, it was organized that their deaths by firing squad were in actual fact not as fatal as they seemed. When the time came for the execution, the prisoners were taken to the central hall, from which the execution was to be broadcast, and made to kneel upon a small plinth, held down by manacles so that they would not try and escape. However, upon the base of this plinth were several small needles coated in a fast-acting paralytic. When the prisoners would kneel upon these, they would be pricked by the needles and soon fall into a deep paralysis. The firing squad, meanwhile, were armed with blank bullets, and their executions were so expertly timed that to all viewing they appeared to fire, the prisoner slumped over, and it would seem the sentence had been carried out. Once this had been done, the prisoner's remains were seemingly taken away for processing, but in actual fact they were transported to the laboratory cells for a very different kind of processing. In order to test the travel machines properly, the subjects would need to be willing and ready to submit to any and all instructions relayed to them. To that effect, a combination of transorbital lobotomies and psychoactive conditionings were performed in order to render them docile and obedient, ready to perform their duties in the survival of the colored race. Our first travel machines were built around an apparatus previously designed by the medical elite as a means of a mobile life support system. However, after the ministers of the survival elite issued their reprocessing order, it was decided to halt development of such systems so that those who may require life support to continue living could instead give their lives to ensure the survival of future generations. The life support apparatus required extensive modifications. Previously nothing more than a mobile chair, I personally oversaw its redesigns to include a sealed dome, external appendages, and exterior sensors to allow the occupant to interact with the outside world whilst remaining safe within the confines of the travel machine. It was also decided to adapt the neutronic-resistant alloys previously used on our dropships in the early days of the war, and also on the dome, for the external casings. Metal that would not only be able to withstand the radiation on the surface for extended periods of time, but also provide adequate protection from any hostile incursions. Eventually, an assembly of 6 travel machines were constructed, and once their operators had been installed into them, the first tests began. The results proved to be far better than anticipated. Not only did the subjects obey their every command, but with minimal instruction, they were able to work together as a team and overcome physical obstacles such as moving larger pieces of equipment. Looking back on this now, I wonder if perhaps there was always something deeper, an inherent sense of self-awareness and intelligence that no amount of conditioning could remove. Had it not been for that, I may not be here now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Physical tests were one thing, but eventually it came time to test the true purpose of these travel machines, to see if they were able to operate upon the surface of Skaro. Alas, due to the intense radiation and limited signal range of our transmitters from within the dome, it was not possible to monitor them remotely, and so, As head of the travel machine project, I volunteered to accompany them outside. We had radiation suits that would provide protection for a short time, long enough to conduct several experiments and gain data of the travel machine's ability to operate on the planet's surface. It had also been several weeks since a reconnaissance mission had been launched to salvage any useful equipment from the surface, and so it was decided to program the travel machines with the directive to seek and locate any useful technology that may provide the dome with more resources. Stepping out onto the surface was unlike anything I had experienced before. The devastation and rage of the neutronic storm, the sky shrouded in green clouds as lightning flashed in the distance, and the deep rumble of tremors could be heard far off. And yet, it was almost peaceful. Not another soul to be seen in sight. Perhaps to anyone else they would have turned and run in fear, but to me it was beautiful. It typified the very pinnacle of the victory in this war. There was no more fight, no more conflict, no more Thals. We had won. It was a rare moment of indulgence on my part, I will admit, but at that moment I felt I had won. There was no one else, only myself and their creations. The colored people may have only been a few miles below me, but on the surface, I ruled supreme, and my travel machines would do my bidding as I instructed them to. And that would be my downfall. Previously our capital city and scientific hub, Kalan had been devastated in the war, sustaining several direct hits from foul neutronic bombardments, now reduced to rubble and ash, and as such had often been avoided due to the high levels of radiation. But now that we had machines capable of withstanding it, the potential salvage in the ruins was far too great an opportunity to pass up, and I set about giving the travel machines their orders. Any and all technology that could be utilized should be salvaged and gathered for transportation back to the dome. The travel machines gathered many useful things, spare parts that could be used to replace rundown components, materials that could be processed for energy, and they even found one or two Thal energy weapons dating back to the early days of the war. The trials, it would seem, were successful, and it was nearing the time when they were programmed to return in order to journey with me back to the dome, when I saw them emerging from the ruins carrying a large object. And to my horror, I realized it was an unexploded neutronic device. And at that moment, there was a flash of bright white light. As strange as it may sound, my memories of the next few moments aren't all that clear, a fact that is both surprising and unsurprising. Being caught in a neutronic blast isn't something you think you'd forget, and yet I still wonder how much of what I remember of that moment actually happened. For example, you would think I would be deafened by a blast like that. Indeed I was. And yet, I remember no sound of an explosion. In fact, I don't really remember anything. No. I remember that bright white flash. And then I remember pain. Pain like I had never experienced before. I remember feeling the flesh peel away from my bones, my skin sizzle and blister as what remained of my radiation suit and my clothes blazed in neutronic fire. I remember trying to push myself up, only to realize that my left arm ended in a torn stump, and as I used my right arm to drag myself up, I felt the skin and muscle sinews in my legs tear, and as I fell back to the ground, my legs came away from my body. I remember rolling onto my back, the hot dust and ash on the ground collecting in my wounds, and looking down, seeing my body on fire. But I know this last part is a false memory. My wounds gathered dust My body burned, but I saw nothing. The last thing I saw was the bright white blast of the bomb as I felt the optical nerves of my eyes burn away into ashes. Then I remember feeling like I was being lifted, and I momentarily thought to myself I was rescued, before I realized that no one would be able to come within the blast radius and survive, and so I believed myself to be taken by the gods. And at that moment I prayed to them, the gods of old. Dal-eks, save me. Then things become clearer again. My vision, a blue haze, as if looking through a tinted visor, the faces of my scientific elite brethren staring back at me with a mixture of anticipation and horror across their faces. I tried to blink to clear the haze, and I realized I couldn't. My eyes were closed, and yet I could see. I realized I didn't need to blink. A lifelong, involuntarily bodily response reduced suddenly to redundancy. I was informed several months had passed since the blast, and upon recovery of my body, I underwent countless medical procedures to save my life, but at great cost. My left arm was permanently paralyzed, my left hand gone, as were my legs, and my eyes, my non-blinking eyes, they had been replaced by a single lens in my forehead. Technology to replace flesh. The blast had left my body ravaged. It lived when perhaps it should not have. But using my own adaptations to the mobile life support unit I had used to create the very travel machines that had caused my disfigurement, the scientific elite had been able to create a system to sustain my body, to keep me alive, if alive could even be considered the right word. In another twist of ironic hypocrisy, it was the survival elite themselves who suggested the idea of a mobile life support system to save my life, when they had let countless others die in the name of survival of our race. They took it upon themselves to, in their own words, ensure one of the scientific elite's most brilliant minds survived for the good of the colored race. But it was my travel machines themselves. They had saved me. Of their own free will, they had decided to save their creator, to take me back to the dome. I had prayed to the gods to save me, and I had been saved. And throughout having this story relayed to me, I kept thinking about my eyes. My eyes replaced by technology, my legs replaced by a mobile travel unit. Many of my bodily functions now taken over by a life support system. So little physical form needed to live, to survive, and my new mobile life support system would sustain me far longer than any other living being. I had prayed to the gods, the Daleks, to save me, and my own travel machines had done just that. And I thought back to the surface, that moment when I felt I ruled supreme. Up there, I had been God, and I had created the gods, the Daleks, that saved me. And in that moment, I looked around at the scientific elite, the men and women who had saved my life, whose goal was the survival of our race, and I realized that I could save them, that I could make our race survive. But just as I had to adapt to ensure my survival, so would they. But I think that's enough for today. End log entry 73-4. Ah, it seems our visitor is awake. I think it's about time I visited him in the cells. We have a lot to catch up on, and it has been rather some time since my life support systems were given the once-over by a doctor.